So the act of surrender is a beautiful thing. And then that other song, my chains are gone, I've been set free. And we're talking about obedience this morning, guidelines for obedience out of Ephesians 6. And so I don't know if that's why you picked Matthew, but that's bringing the concept of slavery. Because Paul talks about slaves this morning and what they should or shouldn't do. And most of us think, well, the only thing I know about slavery, I know that we had in this country a long time ago, and I've never really been in it. Maybe you feel like you're in it sometimes when you barely have enough money to pay the bill and everything gets expensive, and before you know it, you're paying $4 for a dozen eggs and that kind of stuff. Maybe you feel like you're stuck in a bad spot you can't get out of. But I thought about how it's kind of ironic that we, much of our lives have been enslaved, haven't we? We've been enslaved to sin. And if you make it practical, sin, sometimes we use that in a big catch-all type of way. But how many of us have been enslaved to severe bouts of depression or anxiety, constant worrying? How many of you grew up really poor, and no matter how much money you got in the bank, every day you're looking at your bank account. Do I have enough? Do I have enough? Do I have enough? You know what I'm talking about? Some of you do. When you grow up really hard, sometimes you're constantly worried. Will I have enough? I've even heard very famous, wealthy people say that they grew up in hard circumstances. Have you ever heard of Steve Harvey before? Comedian, TV host, etc. He was homeless for a while, lived in his car, and I've heard him talk about, and I don't know how much money he's got, but I'm guessing he's probably got more than most of us do. He still always wants to work a lot, because even now, he still remembers what it was like to be homeless, and he doesn't ever want to be homeless again. So even though he's probably got loads of money at this point, that constant memory or worry is still there, and he wrestles with that. So imagine having probably millions of dollars in the bank, and he's still worried he's not going to have enough. And I'm not saying that to put him down, but just to show you, it's not always, is our money just right, our relationships just right? Sometimes we develop wrong beliefs and fears that we get enslaved to. And so even though we're talking about, on some level, physical slavery out of this passage, just be aware. You may not have physical chains on, but if you're not careful, you can have spiritual or emotional chains on. Because, slavery doesn't really apply to us in 21st century America today. But there are people around the world that still have to deal with real physical slavery. Sex traffickers, drug traffickers, all sorts of stuff. Stuff that's usually hidden, but it's still there. And then there are parts of the world that actual slaves that are openly, that still happens too in some sections. So what does Paul mean, and how can we get something out of this in Ephesians 6? So Paul starts out, last week we looked at husbands and wives and that relationship and how we can do well as either husband or wife, whatever role you're in, and maybe you're not in either. But you can still probably get some takeaways from that. Same thing today. Everybody in this room has either been a kid or a parent at some point, and maybe you're both. So maybe you're not a 5-year-old right now, maybe you're an 85-year-old, or vice versa. Maybe you've got little kids at home, or maybe you are a little kid. So either way, the passage applies to us because we've all been children at some point, and many of us are parents or grandparents at this point. But Paul starts out and he tells children to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then he gives a quote from Exodus, and also it's repeated in Deuteronomy, what we call the fifth commandment. You've probably heard of the 10 Commandments. Well, the fifth one is honor your father and mother. And honoring, a lot of times, goes along with obedience. It doesn't always necessarily translate into that, because at some point, if your parents are asking you to do bad, illegal things, that's not necessarily the same that, oh, I'm 50 years old and my parents just asked me to go do something really awful. Well, no. I don't think that you've got to honor your parents and obey every single thing they ask you to do, especially if it's illegal or bad. But you should still, even as an old kid, right? Because maybe you think, I'm a 70-year-old kid right now. Well, yeah, or a 40-year-old kid, right? Or whatever you are. We're always a kid to somebody, right? Even if your parents have passed away. So, honoring your parents definitely means, I think, elevating and respecting them. But as a little kid, I do think obedience is something that goes along with that. And at some point, we talked about this last week, if you're 30, 40, 50 years old, you have to leave and cleave, right? So children obeying their parents is important. It actually was a promise that to the Israelites meant they would actually live longer in the promised land, because Israel, for the Israelites, was the promised land. Well, today we don't really have that same setup. It's the New Testament. We're not really in a land of Israel situation. So you notice, even though it talks about living long in the land, it doesn't really say specifically the land of Israel. And why is that? Well, because maybe that promise still applies, but maybe more in a spiritual sense for us today. Will we have more fullness of life? Do we have eternal life? And so forth. And yes. So there's still a blessing, I think, connected to this command to honor your father and mother. And it is good for children to obey their parents in the Lord. Why do you think it's good for kids to obey their parents? I don't know how good you are at math. Did any of you, as a kid, have a parent that was older than you? Anybody? He's throwing out that algebra stuff, isn't he? Every single person in this room had a parent that was older than them. What does that mean? Well, it could mean a lot of things, but what it hopefully means is that they have more life experience and more wisdom than you. So yes, if you're in this room today, or you have been at some point at 30 or 40 or 50 years old, you ought to have a little more wisdom than a 3-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old, if you get what I'm saying. So, if you're 20 or 30 years older than your kid, or any age really, you have lived longer than that kid, and you ought to know more than that kid. So, do you care about your kid as a parent? Hopefully, yes. Now, every now and then, yes, there's bad situations and people that make really bad decisions, and I get that. There are abusive situations. So, I don't think Paul necessarily is talking about every bad possibility out there, but just as a general concept, children should obey their parents in the Lord. For one, there's a good promise connected to that, and we'll look at this in a little bit. Parents ought to have the best interest for their kids. So, children, are you obeying your parents in the Lord? And maybe at this point, maybe you think, I'm 50 or 60 or 70 years old, maybe my parents aren't even alive anymore. Okay, well maybe at this point, it's not an obedience thing. Can you still respect your parents even though you might be 60 or 70 years old? Believe it or not, when you honor the Lord, I do think that actually reflects back on you respecting or honoring your parents. Have you ever heard somebody say, whose kid is that? Oh, well, that's so-and-so. That explains a lot. You ever heard something like that before? Why is that? Because kids tend to reflect their parents? I get it. Kids, you can't control everything that your kid does. I get that. But as a general statement, do kids tend to go in the direction you point them? Yeah. Because you tend to have more influence over your kids than random people you've never met before. You're with them a lot more than most people. So parents have, compared to other people, an excessive amount of, and not excessive in a bad way, maybe I should say just a great degree of influence that a lot of people don't. There are other people at church, people at school and so forth that have influence, but parents tend to have the most influence in part because they have the most time, but also flesh and blood. You tend to listen to your own flesh and blood more than a random stranger. That's just kind of how family works sometimes. Sometimes that can be great and sometimes not so great. The children should obey their parents in the Lord because there's a promise associated with it. And also, too, if you read Romans 1 and 2 Timothy 3, a sign of society and culture kind of going downhill is actually considered disobedience to parents. If you've ever been a parent, you know you blow it a lot. Anybody willing to admit that today? I've blown it a lot. I'm not a perfect dad by any stretch of the imagination. So that being said, if I could go back and undo every mistake I've ever made, I'd be glad to do that. That being said, I still love my kids. and I still want the best for my kids. And I hope that I've done more good for my kids than I have harm. And hopefully you can say that same thing. Even with your mistakes and your faults and failures, you've done your best, and hopefully you've done more good and helped them more than you have hurt them. So with that in mind, when kids disobey their parents, that's not a good sign. In 2 Timothy 3, verse 2, it talks about how in the last times things are going to get rough. And some things mentioned, people will love themselves. People will love money. Well, let's think about that. Does anybody love themselves in our country? Does anybody love money in our country? Is anybody proud in our country? Is anybody arrogant? Is anybody abusive? Not a great list, is it? But notice in that list, disobedient to parents. What? Proud, arrogant, loving himself and money, etc. Disobedient to parents is in there? Yeah. Why is that? Because in a healthy, and remember, healthy, I'm not talking about all the bad abusive situations, because I have seen some of that firsthand. Some of it you see about on the news. So I'm not talking about the bad stuff. But in a healthy family, parents should follow the Lord, do what's right, and teach their kids to do what's right in a healthy, loving way. So children, should you obey your mom and dad? Yeah, they're trying to lead you in the path that's right. You should trust that they, even when you can't see it. And hey, let's throw this back. I am still a kid of God right now. Sometimes God might say, go over here. That kind of looks scary, God. I don't know about that, God. I feel better right here. Why don't you let somebody else go over there? All of a sudden, you kind of get what it feels like to be a kid again. When God, who can see everything, says, go over there. You're like, I've never been over there before. I don't think so. I don't know about that. Now think about it with your kids. You tell them to go over there. I've never done that before. So this isn't just to yell at your kids and point a finger, obey me immediately, okay? It's not that kind of thing. Can you put your arm around your kid? Hey, I love you. Hey, I think you're going to be okay. I know you've never done that before, but I've done that before, and I think it's going to help you. You see what I mean? A loving parent doesn't just yell commands and beat kids if they don't listen. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. A loving father and mother sometimes puts their arm around their kid and says, hey, I'm here for you. It might be hard for you to obey right now, but if you trust me, I really do want the best, and I think you'll be okay if you pull through this and do that. I don't think it's going to go well for you if you do that. Everything that we do ought to be done in an obedient and loving and respectful way, because ultimately we're God's kids. Do we trust Him? Do we obey Him? And kids, do you obey your parents? And then if we're parents, are we teaching our kids to walk in the path that's right? So Paul talks about how kids should obey their parents, but then he also talks about how parents should nurture their kids. The word fathers is here used, but I think you also sometimes may see it translated parents. Do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Just like last week, we talked about how being in a husband-wife relationship is kind of a two-way street. Maybe you have different roles and you should do different things or act a little bit differently. Ultimately, you're both supposed to obey and follow the Lord, right? But the relationship might look slightly different. Same thing with kids and parents. Really, kids should obey the Lord. Parents should obey the Lord. But because of the obvious difference, kids are younger than their parents, kids don't know as much as their parents. Parents can teach stuff to their kids that the kids just don't know. Why do you have teachers in school? Because they know stuff the students don't know, right? You see what I'm saying? Everybody needs to be taught. The day we stop learning is the day we're in trouble. So you might be sitting here thinking, I'm 80 years old or 100 years old or whatever. Hey, try to keep learning until the day you die, because part of the parent-child relationship is that we're growing together. We're teaching them as we learn too. The thing about this, if a kid's supposed to obey their parents, shouldn't parents try to show them the right path in life? Shouldn't parents actually set a good example for their kids? And this is where I think parents can get in trouble. How many parents take advantage of their kids, abuse their kids, manipulate their kids just because it's easy to? A lot. Sometimes it's really bad, obvious illegal abuse, stuff that you can literally go to jail for, go to court, and lose your kids over. But sometimes it's more subtle. Can you manipulate a kid mentally, psychologically, play head games with them? Hey, this is why it's so important every day for all of us to walk with the Lord, because God is pure and holy. He doesn't play mind games with us. Now the devil will. And sometimes we might confuse the devil with God, right? Because we get stuck in a bad, confusing situation. God doesn't play mind games with you. So us as parents, and even if your kid's 40 years old right now, don't manipulate them and mess with them. Oh, I'm feeling really bad today. Can you take a vacation day and come hang out with me? When really you're just bored. Don't make your kid waste a vacation day because you have nothing else to do. You see what I'm saying? Like, you can mess with people, and guess what? Your kids are probably going to go along with it because they love you. But don't do that, parents. Don't provoke your kids to wrath or anger or going down the wrong path. Because you actually have a special relationship that nobody else does. So don't take advantage of that. Psalm 127:3 says, "Children are a heritage or a gift from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward." So think about that. If kids are a gift from God, a heritage from the Lord, why would we want to abuse that or take advantage of that? So Paul talks about kids and parents and how that relationship should work, but then you also see a shift to servants or slaves and masters. Now, none of us have ever been in slavery in a literal physical sense, have we? Usually when people hear the term slavery in modern U.S. Culture, what do we think? We probably think about the 1800s, right? Or maybe the 1700s, the antebellum South. People were on plantations doing hard labor, that kind of thing. And that certainly was a time in history that, yes, that kind of stuff happened in our country. Today, there's still slavery around the world, as I mentioned earlier. Sometimes it's obvious and open. A lot of times it's secretive. People are forced into bad situations, kidnapped, blackmailed, trafficked, that kind of thing. But back in Ephesus, when this was written, there was a very large amount of slaves and servants that lived in the city. Some estimates say that possibly a third of the city, think about it, a third of the city of Ephesus was some type of slave or servant. That's a lot of people. Imagine, and I'll round it down, I think in the Cincinnati area, I think it's closer to a couple million people, but let's round it down and make it a little easier, 1.5 million. So if we cut that into third, imagine if 500,000 people in Cincinnati were servants or slaves. That's a lot of people, isn't it? So why would Paul include this section? Well, if you got a third of your city is in some type of slavery or servitude, yeah, that's a bunch of people. And so Paul wanted to make sure that these people that didn't have the same legal rights as free people, they were addressed. Because think about it. I've never been a slave in a physical sense. You've never been a slave. It's really easy for masters to take advantage of their slaves and servants. There's different. Today, when somebody works for somebody, you're either typically an employee or a contractor. But we get a paycheck out of it, and we're not obligated by a penalty of getting a beating or death. Like if I don't show up to work tomorrow, it may not go well with my boss, but I'm probably not going to get chained up to a wall and beaten for it. You see what I'm saying? So yeah, it was different back then. So masters had a whole lot of power over their slaves and servants. But you had slaves who, sometimes slaves were slaves because of some type of battle. People would battle each other. Whoever won would enslave the people. All right, you're coming with me. You're my slave now. That literally happened. Sometimes people may have been enslaved. Maybe they had some massive debt. Have you ever owed somebody like $100,000 or some huge number? And I don't mean on a mortgage. I'm talking like a loan shark at 20% interest, and you don't have to raise your hand. How many of you would like to organize crime figure 20% on $100,000? You probably don't. You know what I'm saying? It's probably not a great situation. And I'm not saying all the situations were like that. But sometimes people had such a massive debt They would go to the person and involuntarily say, I will be your servant. A lot of times it would last for 7 years or until the debt was paid off. So, when you see the term bondservant, that was somebody who wasn't a slave through some type of purchase or victory, where one city or country beat another and just enslaved the people. So bondservant usually meant it was voluntary. Hey, I owe so much money to you, can I be your servant? Okay, 7, 8 years, however long it took. And then if you were a bondservant to Caesar, it was double, that was 14 years. And then you had just, I don't know if you want to call it regular servant, maybe that's a little bit closer to what we call an employee or just somebody that works for somebody else. But you had different degrees of people that were some type of slave-servant situation. So, Paul told bondservants that some versions use slave right there, some say bondservant, some might say servants, but obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. So, we're not slaves, but think of this. Do you work for anybody right now? Do you have a boss? Do you have anybody that tells you what to do on this earth? You probably either do or have, right, at some point. Maybe you're retired or, getting a pension or something, but at some point you probably get the concept, your boss pays your check, your boss tells you what to do, right? That's kind of how it works. I don't usually think this way. Like every day when I get up and work, I don't think, God, I'm working for you today. But yeah, there are times that I do. There are times that thought crosses my mind. God, help me to please you at work today. But what if every day as employees, and even if you're not employed, maybe you're retired or disabled or whatever, but what if you say, God, help me to praise you and glorify you in everything I do today? I'm going to a bank. I'm going to a factory. I'm going to cut yards or whatever I do. You can glorify God. I can't imagine it would be fun to be a slave. I can't imagine to say, I owe this guy 10 years of my life because of this massive debt I've accrued. Does anybody here want to be stuck to somebody for 10 years? I don't. I can tell you that. Maybe if you got a big mortgage right now, you might be thinking, man, I have 20 years left on my mortgage. I'm a slave to the bank for 20 more years. But wouldn't that make a difference if, hey, God, hold on, I might physically on earth be working for this person, but ultimately I am working to please you and to love you and to glorify you. So help me to work in light of the fact that I'm answering ultimately to you. Because if you keep going down, Paul says in verse 7 of Ephesians 6, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. So at work, are you doing things that are honoring to God, not just to your boss? Hey, I've had plenty of jobs where I've had threatening bosses, I've had demeaning bosses, I've had people scream obscenities in my face, I've had all sorts of stuff. So yes, I get it. There are bosses out there that are not pleasant to work for at all. Was I working for the Lord or for that person? Right now, your boss at work. And sometimes it probably feels demeaning when you're 40 or 50 years old and that new boss is 25 or 30. They've never done this before. You think, I've been doing this 30 years. Hey, who are you working for? Are you working for that person that's 20 years younger than you, or are you working for God in heaven? So, that does make a difference. God, it is so hard for me to be here, but help me to please you. Help me to work for you. Help me to act like I'm doing this job as though you're my boss. And listen to this. Knowing that whatever good anyone does, Paul says, that he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or free. So in God's eyes, it doesn't matter if you're a bondservant, a slave, or the master or the owner. God sees everything that all of us do. Did you know that? Maybe you're thinking, yeah, I got my Rolls Royce and I got millions in the bank and I'm a member of the country club. And you might think, I'm on welfare, I'm on disability, I'm barely getting by at $800 a month on some tiny little government check. You know what? When you do the right thing, God sees that. And when you do good, God's going to help you and bless you. So don't do evil for evil. That's what the world does, right? Oh yeah, punch you in the face and punch him back twice as hard, right? Punch him 2 or 3 times. He stole $10, steal 20 from him and teach him a lesson. That's kind of how the world operates. But Paul says to people that are probably, some of them in bad situations, do good to the Lord, and God's going to bless you for it. Then towards the very end, he gives some instructions to masters. Masters, do the same to them. Well, hang on, I bought that guy at the auction. He belongs to me, I own him. Hey, hold on. That guy that you bought at the auction as a slave owner is created in the image of God just as much as you are a slave owner. So, don't get me wrong, I don't think that Paul necessarily is giving a dissertation here about the pros and cons of slavery. I think he's just addressing people that are literal slave owners, literal servants, literal slaves, etc. He's just dealing with what he's got. And the culture back then, that's just how it was. Slaves and slave owners and masters and servants and that kind of stuff existed. So I think Paul's dealing with it. I don't think he's necessarily advocating for the system, but he is telling the masters, hey, I'm telling the servants what to do, but masters, you need to be doing the same thing. You need to be treating these people well. And listen to this. Stop your threatening. And if we are in a situation today, we run a company, people answer to us, how do you treat your people? In a healthy way, in a productive way? How do you treat your people? In a healthy way, in a productive way? Because the reality is, sometimes you got to confront people. Sometimes there's got to be consequences. That's just life. You learn through mistakes and failures and having judgments or consequences, right? But can you do that in a helpful way, in a loving way, in a productive way? Yeah. Don't berate people. Don't threaten people. Don't just harass people over their problems and their mistakes. If you're a supervisor, treat them with dignity and respect. Notice is the end of this section. So basically, masters are supposed to do good, like you're doing it to the Lord as well. They could take advantage of their slaves and servants, but they shouldn't. It says at the very end, knowing that God, who is both their master and yours, is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. Right now, you probably live either on the right side of the tracks or the wrong side of the tracks. You live in a really fancy, nice neighborhood, or a mediocre one, or not so great. You know what? In heaven, that doesn't matter. You might be living on Crack House Alley. And maybe you think, yeah, they should rename that street that because you should see what happens at night. Or maybe you're living on Millionaire Road. And you can't even get on the street unless you got a Mercedes. You know what I'm saying? In heaven, God doesn't say, oh, you got a Rolls Royce, you're good. Oh, ignore all your bad stuff. Oh, well, you were poor. I got to judge you now. No, there's no partiality. So what do you got, 50 cents or 50 million bucks? God doesn't value you and judge you based on your money. He doesn't base your house size or your square footage, or if you got a 20-year-old Pontiac. They don't make Pontiacs anymore. I don't know if you do that. Or if you got a brand new Cadillac or Rolls Royce. It doesn't matter. Because guess what? All of us, myself included, answer to God, and God's going to judge us impartially one day. So, how do you treat your coworkers? Because, yeah, we don't have slave owner things going on that I'm aware of in this church right now. But you probably got a boss and coworkers, and maybe even people that answer to you. How do you treat people around you? Like you treat the Lord that way? Children and parents. Children, are you obeying your parents in the Lord? And parents, are you treating your children in a way that they would want to obey? And ultimately, all of us are children of God. So, do we cling to our Father in heaven? Do we obey our Father in heaven? Do we run to Him? Do we surrender our burdens? The older I get, the more aware of how much fear I have wrestled with. I'm comfortable in what I know. I go home. I go to the same restaurant. I go to the same job day in and day out, right? We get comfortable. But it's scary when you have to jump ship and change jobs, change houses, change stuff that you feel good about. You know what? In those difficult, frightening times, you know when God helps us grow a whole lot? It's not the comfortable times, it's the difficult times. So, we're asking our physical kids on earth to obey when they're little. Are we obeying God? Are we listening, seeking God's voice day in, day out? It's easy to obey when God says, hey, do the same thing you've always done. It's really easy. When God says, hey, actually, you see that dark wood section you've never been before? Yeah, go over there. Ooh, I don't know about that. It's a little bit harder, isn't it? So remember, if you got kids at home, or maybe you're in a spot where you're helping raise your grandkids, they got fears and worries just like you, so try to help them through that in a loving way. Try to treat them with respect. And if you're here today in a kid situation, hey, your parents actually probably know more than you. Maybe you should listen to them. And hey, if you work right now, and a lot of people do, treat your people that report to you decently, like you treat the Lord that way. And if you work for somebody, maybe they're a horrible boss and you hate their guts. Remember, you don't work for that person as much as you work for the Lord. And maybe that'll actually help you have a different perspective on your job every day. Let's pray. Father, help us to honor you and love you. Help us to respect those around us and understand authority and submission, but also help us to be good examples and shine a bright light to the dark world. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.